The Vatican City is the smallest sovereign state in the world, yet for centuries it has projected moral authority over more than 1 billion Catholics. Marble halls, ancient rituals, and whispered prayers form the public image. But behind that sacred facade exists another institution, far less understood and infinitely more controversial: the Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. Officially, the bank exists to manage assets for religious orders, charities, and clergy. Unofficially, critics argue it became one of the most convenient financial blind spots in modern history. Unlike normal banks, the Vatican Bank operates under a unique legal status. It answers not to Italy, not to the European Union, and historically not even to international banking regulators. For decades, it had no obligation to disclose clients, transactions, or auditing procedures. That secrecy, once justified as protection for persecuted clergy during wartime, became a perfect shelter for something else: money that did not want to be seen. In post-World War II Europe, organized crime was evolving. No longer satisfied with street-level rackets, mafia syndicates began entering high finance. They needed channels to move profits from drugs, arms, and corruption into the legitimate economy. They needed banks that would ask no questions. The Vatican Bank asked none. By the late 1960s and 1970s, whispers began circulating in Italian financial circles. Strange transfers, shell companies, billions passing through Vatican-linked accounts without clear origin or destination. Prosecutors suspected something massive, but they faced a wall of immunity. Italian investigators could not raid the Vatican. They could not subpoena Vatican officials. They could not force disclosure. And behind that wall, powerful alliances were forming. At the center of this growing storm was a group of men who seemed to operate at the crossroads of faith, politics, intelligence agencies, and organized crime. One of them was Michele Sindona, a flamboyant Italian banker with ties to the Sicilian Mafia. Another was Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, once Italy's largest private bank. Looming in the shadows was Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of a secretive Masonic lodge known as Propaganda 2, or P2. These men were not priests. They were not cardinals, yet they moved freely through Vatican corridors. They met with archbishops. They handled Vatican money, and in some cases they claimed to be acting on behalf of the Holy See itself. The result was an unholy alliance. Organized crime gained access to one of the most opaque financial systems on earth, and the Vatican Bank gained powerful partners who could move, hide, and multiply money beyond the reach of secular law. To understand how this happened, we must first understand the Vatican Bank's unusual origin. Founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII, the bank was created during the chaos of World War II. Europe's financial systems were collapsing. Religious orders needed a safe place to store assets. The Vatican, protected by neutrality and sovereignty, seemed ideal. But what began as a protective measure slowly became something else. After the war, Cold War politics reshaped everything. The Vatican feared communism more than almost any other force. Communist governments were aggressively anti-religious. Churches were seized. Priests were imprisoned. In response, the Vatican quietly supported anti-communist movements around the world. Supporting those movements required money, large amounts of money. Much of it moved secretly, and secrecy became institutionalized. By the 1960s, the Vatican Bank had become a financial ghost. It existed. It moved billions. But almost no one outside a small inner circle truly knew how it operated. This environment attracted men like Sindona and Calvi. They understood something fundamental. If you could route money through the Vatican Bank, it became nearly untouchable. No tax authority, no prosecutor, no financial watchdog, just silent transfers blessed by diplomatic immunity. For organized crime, this was better than any Swiss account. For corrupt politicians, It was better than offshore havens. For intelligence agencies, it was a dream pipeline. And for certain Vatican insiders, it became a source of enormous influence. What began as cooperation soon turned into dependency. The Vatican Bank relied on outside bankers to invest and grow its assets. Those bankers relied on the Vatican's secrecy to conceal illegal profits. Each side protected the other. By the late 1970s, the system had grown so large and so complex that even some Vatican officials reportedly no longer understood its full scope. Money flowed through labyrinths of shell companies in Panama, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein, fake charities, phantom corporations, accounts with religious-sounding names that masked criminal ownership. It was financial alchemy. Dirty money went in, clean-looking money came out, and no one could trace the transformation, at least not officially. But scandals have a way of surfacing, and when they did, they revealed a story far darker than anyone imagined. A story of bankers falling from bridges, of popes dying suddenly, of secret lodges manipulating governments, and of a church struggling to reconcile its spiritual mission with the corruption festering at its core. This is not simply a story about crime. It is a story about power, about what happens when sacred authority collides with human greed, and about how an institution built to save souls found itself accused of helping launder the wealth of some of the world's most ruthless criminals. In Part 2, we step into the world of Michele Sindona, the Mafia's favorite banker, and trace how his rise marked the beginning of the Vatican Bank's descent into scandal. Michele Sindona did not look like a criminal mastermind. He wore tailored suits. He spoke softly. He quoted economic theory and Catholic doctrine with equal ease. To the public, he was a financial genius who embodied Italy's post-war economic miracle. To the Mafia, he was something far more valuable. He was the man who could make dirty money disappear. Born in Sicily, Sindona grew up surrounded by the silent power of organized crime. He learned early that real influence did not come from guns alone, but from controlling financial arteries. By the 1960s, he had built a vast network of banks and holding companies stretching from Italy to Switzerland to the United States. But Sindona wanted more than wealth. He wanted legitimacy, and legitimacy, in Catholic Italy, often flowed through the church. Sindona cultivated relationships with powerful clergy, presenting himself as a devout Catholic businessman committed to defending Christian civilization against communism. This narrative resonated deeply within the Vatican during the Cold War. Soon, Sindona became an unofficial financial advisor to Vatican officials. He helped invest church funds. He structured international transactions. He opened pathways into American finance. In return, he gained access to something priceless, the Vatican Bank's shield. Through accounts connected to the Vatican Bank, Sindona allegedly moved enormous sums of mafia money derived from heroin trafficking, extortion, and illegal gambling. These funds were mixed with legitimate Vatican investments, making them nearly impossible to separate. For years, the arrangement flourished. Sindona expanded aggressively, but his empire was built on fraud. He falsified balance sheets. He looted subsidiaries. He shuffled debts between shell companies. It was a classic Ponzi structure disguised as international banking. Eventually, the structure began to collapse. In the early 1970s, several of Sindona's banks failed spectacularly. Thousands of investors lost money. Italian authorities launched investigations, and suddenly, the man once praised as a financial wizard was exposed as a swindler. Sindona fled to the United States, where he attempted to portray himself as a victim of political persecution. Behind the scenes, he tried to blackmail former allies. He hinted that he possessed documents proving Vatican involvement in illegal transactions. He suggested that if he went down, powerful churchmen would go down with him. Then something extraordinary happened. In 1979, while under house arrest in New York, Sindona was kidnapped. The media was stunned. For weeks, his whereabouts were unknown. Then he resurfaced in Italy, claiming he had been abducted by mysterious forces. Italian prosecutors were not convinced. They believed the kidnapping had been staged by Sindona himself. Why? Because it bought time, time to move money, time to destroy records, time to negotiate, but Sindona's luck had run out. He was convicted of multiple counts of fraud. Later, he was convicted for ordering the murder of an Italian lawyer who had investigated his finances. In 1986, Sindona died in prison after drinking coffee laced with cyanide. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, many believe he was silenced, because Sindona knew too much. He knew about the Vatican Bank. He knew about mafia pipelines. He knew about political protection. And he knew about another banker who had taken over much of his role, a man named Roberto Calvi. Calvi was different from Sindona in style. Where Sindona was flamboyant, Calvi was secretive. Where Sindona sought public praise, Calvi avoided attention. But their function was the same. They were financial engineers for invisible empires. Calvi ran Banco Ambrosiano, a respected Milan-based bank with close ties to the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank was Ambrosiano's largest shareholder. This relationship gave Calvi enormous credibility. It also gave him access to Vatican-linked accounts and offshore structures. Calvi began creating a web of shell companies across Central America and Europe. These companies borrowed billions from Ambrosiano. The money vanished into black holes. Much of it, investigators later concluded, had been laundered for criminal organizations and political operations. Like Sindona, Calvi presented himself as a defender of Christianity against communism. Like Sindona, he cultivated ties with shadowy power brokers. And like Sindona, his empire eventually began to collapse. But Calvi's downfall would be far more dramatic and far more symbolic. Because when Roberto Calvi died, he did not die quietly in a prison cell. He died hanging beneath a bridge in London, a death that would come to be known as God's banker's final confession. In Part 3, we follow Roberto Calvi's rise and mysterious death, and how it exposed the Vatican Bank to the greatest scandal in its history. Roberto Calvi understood one truth better than most bankers: perception is everything. As long as people believed Banco Ambrosiano was solid, it would remain solid. As long as they believed the Vatican Bank stood behind it, no one would ask uncomfortable questions. Calvi cultivated an image of quiet respectability. But behind the scenes, he was running one of the most elaborate financial shell games in European history. Using a network of offshore companies, Calvi moved billions out of Banco Ambrosiano's balance sheet. Loans were issued to shell corporations that had no real business activity. Those corporations routed money through multiple jurisdictions. By the time funds resurfaced, their origin was impossible to trace. This system served multiple masters. Organized crime groups used it to launder profits. Political operatives used it to secretly fund operations. And the Vatican Bank used it to move money without oversight. All three benefited. All three were entangled. By 1981, regulators began noticing discrepancies. Banco Ambrosiano's books did not add up. Italian authorities demanded explanations. Calvi stalled. He falsified documents. He bribed officials. But the numbers kept getting worse. In 1982, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed with a shortfall of approximately $13 billion. It was one of the largest banking failures in Italian history. The fallout was immediate. Investigators traced many of Ambrosiano's offshore companies back to accounts linked with the Vatican Bank. Suddenly, the Holy See was connected, at least indirectly, to one of Europe's biggest financial crimes. Calvi panicked. He fled Italy under a false passport. He traveled to London. He booked into a modest hotel. And then, on June 18, 1982, his body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge. His pockets were stuffed with bricks. He had over $15,000 in cash in different currencies. At first, British police ruled the death a suicide, but few believed it. The bricks suggested a ritualistic execution. Blackfriars, translated loosely, means black brothers, a term some associated with secret societies. Calvi had close ties to Licio Gelli and the P2 Masonic Lodge. P2 was not merely a fraternity. It was a clandestine network of military officers, politicians, intelligence chiefs, and businessmen who sought to manipulate Italy from behind the scenes. Many P2 members were later found to have connections to organized crime. Calvi's death looked less like despair and more like a warning, a message to anyone who considered talking. Italian courts eventually reclassified Calvi's death as murder, but no one was ever convicted. Too many suspects, too many powerful interests, too little cooperation. The Vatican Bank, facing international pressure, admitted moral responsibility for Ambrosiano's collapse. It paid $250 million to creditors, but it did not admit legal guilt. No Vatican official was criminally convicted. The institution remained intact. For critics, this was the ultimate insult. A secular banker was found dead under a bridge. A national bank collapsed. Billions vanished. Yet the religious institution at the center of the storm walked away largely untouched. Inside the Vatican, shock turned into fear. The scandal had reached global headlines. Questions were being asked not just about finances, but about spiritual integrity. Had the church become indistinguishable from the corrupt world it claimed to stand above? In 1978, a new pope had been elected who many hoped would bring transparency. He reigned for only 33 days. His name was Pope John Paul I, and his sudden death would fuel some of the darkest suspicions in Vatican history. In Part 4, we explore the mystery surrounding Pope John Paul I and whether his attempts at reform may have cost him his life. When Pope John Paul I ascended to the papacy in August 1978, he immediately stood out. He rejected many symbols of grandeur. He spoke of humility. He emphasized pastoral care over political power. And according to multiple accounts, he began asking uncomfortable questions about Vatican finances. Some Vatican insiders later claimed that John Paul I had reviewed documents related to the Vatican Bank's relationships with Sindona and Calvi. He reportedly expressed alarm. He allegedly planned to remove several high-ranking officials connected to the bank. Then, on September 28, 1978, just 33 days after becoming pope, John Paul I was found dead in his bed. The Vatican announced that he had died of a heart attack. No autopsy was performed. No independent medical examination was allowed. This secrecy ignited immediate speculation. Journalists and authors began investigating. They uncovered testimony from Vatican staff who claimed the official timeline did not match what they had witnessed. Some said the body was discovered by a nun, not the secretary as officially stated. Some said documents were missing from the Pope's room. Conspiracy theories exploded. Was John Paul I poisoned? Was he silenced before he could dismantle a corrupt system? There is no definitive proof, but the context is impossible to ignore. He died at the exact moment when Vatican bank scandals were approaching critical mass. He was replaced by Pope John Paul II, who would reign for over 26 years and face the Ambrosiano fallout. Under John Paul II, the Vatican Bank survived, but reform was slow. Secrecy remained deeply embedded. Over the following decades, new scandals periodically surfaced. Investigations revealed continued use of offshore accounts. Italian authorities occasionally arrested Vatican-linked financiers. Each time, the Vatican promised change. Each time, critics argued it was cosmetic. The deeper issue was structural. The Vatican is both a religious institution and a sovereign state. It operates banks, signs treaties, and engages in geopolitics. This dual nature creates inherent conflicts. Spiritual authority demands moral clarity. State power demands strategic compromise. Where those two collide, corruption can thrive. For believers, the Vatican Bank scandal is deeply painful. It challenges the idea that the Church stands apart from worldly sin. For skeptics, it confirms long-held suspicions that behind holy words lies ordinary human greed. Yet there is another layer. The vast majority of priests, nuns, and lay Catholics have nothing to do with financial crimes. They serve the poor. They run hospitals and schools. They dedicate their lives to faith. The scandal is not about them. It is about a small group of powerful men who operated in darkness. Men who used the language of God to justify the pursuit of money. Men who treated faith as a shield. In Part 5, we examine the long-term consequences of the Vatican Bank scandal and what it reveals about power, secrecy, and the human capacity for self-deception. The Vatican Bank scandal did not end with Calvi's death. It did not end with Sindona's conviction. It did not end with quiet settlements. Its legacy continues to shape how the world views the Catholic Church. In recent years, the Vatican has taken steps toward transparency. It has joined international anti-money laundering frameworks. It has closed thousands of suspicious accounts. It has allowed limited external audits. These reforms suggest an acknowledgement that past practices were unsustainable. But trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. For many Catholics, the scandal creates a painful question. How can an institution that preaches moral purity harbor such profound corruption? There is no easy answer. One possibility is that the Church, like any human organization, is vulnerable to infiltration. Another is that power itself corrupts, regardless of sacred intention. The Vatican Bank story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Holiness does not immunize institutions against human weakness. It never has. From medieval indulgence scandals to modern financial crimes, history shows a recurring pattern. Where enormous power exists without accountability, abuse eventually follows. The real tragedy is not that corruption occurred. The real tragedy is that it was allowed to persist for so long, protected by secrecy, justified by fear, excused by ideology. The phrase, "when popes met mobsters," is not meant literally in every case. It is symbolic. It represents the moment when spiritual leadership intersects with criminal power, when sacred space becomes a transactional marketplace, when God's house becomes a clearinghouse. Yet even within this dark narrative, there is a glimmer of hope. Exposure matters. Journalists, whistleblowers, and investigators refuse to be silent. Their work forced reforms. Their persistence dragged hidden systems into the light. That process is ongoing, and perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. Institutions may claim divine authority, but they still require human accountability. Faith may inspire, but transparency protects. The Vatican Bank scandal is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a warning to churches, to governments, to corporations, to anyone who believes their mission is too noble to be questioned. Because the moment an institution declares itself above scrutiny, it becomes most vulnerable to corruption. And the moment believers stop asking hard questions, they risk confusing loyalty with blindness. The story of the Vatican Bank is not about destroying faith. It is about defending its integrity. Because true faith, if it means anything at all, must be able to survive the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Even when it reveals that beneath the dome, there were shadows, and in those shadows money moved, secrets grew. And the line between the sacred and the profane all but disappeared.